So, people are now clearly talking about early elections in the fall, and they really want to end this coalition as soon as possible. We also heard that yesterday in the context of Saskia Ludwig. And yes, Federal President Frank-Walter Steinmeier said he will know how to prevent all of this. We'll take a look at whether that will really happen in this morning's video. And I'll tell you right now, what everyone out there is talking about could actually become reality now. However, and I just want to mention this briefly, I finally watched the 4-hour Höcke video on Ben's channel. And I have to say there are a few reasons why I don't think the AFD will go along with that in any way. They have completely different plans, and you know I very rarely make AFD videos, but today I want to make one purely based on statistics, because I'm going to explain to you that many people out there who think the AFD will be part of a government will probably end up empty-handed. That's not the goal of the AFD, which I personally would actually consider a good thing. However, there are other ways to achieve stability in this country, and that's what we'll be looking at in detail today. If you want to support this channel, I would appreciate a like and a subscription. A subscription would be great, and let's get started right away. Early elections in the fall, is that possible or not? Ms. Ludwig, could you briefly explain that to us?
Well, I'm very skeptical about that.
How much longer do you think the campaign will last?
That's a good question, similar to the grades.
1 year, 2 years, 3 years?
You're right in the thick of it in the Bundestag, I mean. Yes, that may well be true, but I didn't expect that some things could take such a long time. As for this government and this coalition, I think we'll see this year which direction it's going.
And with that, she really hit the nail on the head. I've been thinking about this a lot over the past few days. Early elections, what happens if the federal president blocks the whole thing? Last week, I still thought he couldn't do that so easily, but there is a single article in the basic law that actually allows him to do it. However, this will be history on January 30, 2027. And if we take a quick look over at Saxony-Anhalt, we'll quickly notice that the elections involving Ulrich Siegmund are happening now. You could really say that the AfD is already taking a bit of a backseat there. And Ulrich Siegmund, the savior of the people here in Germany, steps onto the scene because for the first time people truly have hope. Personally, I also hope that things will get better here and that this class struggle will come to an end. Which class struggle am I talking about? Saskia Ludwig will briefly explain it to you.
And after the statements made by Bärbel Bas towards the employers, I made it clear and explicit that this coalition won't work anymore because the differences are just too great, and that's why I have to say it again. Anyone who appears before employers like that as social affairs minister is engaging in class warfare, so this division that comes with it.
For those who have been following Ben Unscripted's podcast, by the way, this is exactly what Björn Höcke describes, roughly from around minute 58 or 59 to the 2-hour mark. Exactly this class struggle, this political party system, which was actually doomed to fail. And anyone who now says, yes, but that's democracy, that you don't let them participate. No, neither the basic law nor the constitution intended for anyone to be excluded or for any opposition party to ever be pushed out again. That's one of the reasons why, for example, I don't make big videos about the AfD. At the same time, that's also why I don't make any videos like, for example, yesterday in Leipzig. Jeffrey K., yes, the one from yesterday, he was apparently released from the psychiatric hospital, a boxing coach who yesterday decided to drive into cities. This class struggle has to stop, and anyone who keeps adding fuel to the fire is actually partly to blame for the whole thing. And that's exactly what Saskia Ludwig says as well. This government is finished. But because of the SPD's class warfare, and because the SPD also wants to prevent early elections, because Frank-Walter Steinmeier knows exactly what happens when reforms are pushed forward in this country. Back then, he wrote the reforms for Schröder, which completely tore the SPD apart afterwards. The SPD has never recovered from that in its entire life, and he knows very well that this country desperately needs reforms. And on the other hand, yes, the AfD is the worst force we have here in Germany. There is the so-called hooker wing, which says no. The party system as it exists here in Germany is outdated. The people need to decide more. Then you know very well, as was the case during the Weimar Republic among others, that the people are no longer willing to go along with everything. For this, I've brought Volker Böhme-Nessler on board, who will briefly explain the whole thing to you.
Maybe we don't always need formal coalitions. Maybe a minority government is enough. We flinch at that in Germany because we know it from the Weimar Republic.
Many people, like me, for example, or many of you say, yes, it's already like, or it's becoming just like the Weimar Republic. Many people underestimate just one thing. Today we live in the age of media. That means you have access to all kinds of news within seconds, but you can also form your own opinion within seconds. You just have to go online. That's also why yesterday and the day before, SPD members said that in theory, social media could really only have been created by public service institutions, so that it wouldn't develop its own momentum.
We need to broaden our perspective and just think about completely new concepts. And I'd like to suggest a concept or an idea that's very unpopular in Germany. It's about minority governments. That would be one possibility. We've talked about that as well. We also talked about the fact that there are too few coalition possibilities.
I can explain to you very simply why so many people are afraid of it. The indoctrination goes like this. Weimar Republic. The fascists come to power and then they can quickly govern without a majority and would drive this country into disaster. By the way, that didn't work in Denmark, for example. Today in Denmark, there is a social democratic-led government tolerated by the right, and it works wonderfully. We all love the Danish model. From the right all the way to the far left. More on that later. But what the EU is trying to do now, because they know these governments are quite unstable, is to take away even more information from the population. And here, for example, this brings us to age restrictions. Anyone who is not able to authenticate themselves, like for example many elderly people who simply can't get more access to the internet because they don't know how to do it. Or for young people, they've now come up with another clever move, namely to restrict VPNs. Here too they acted very, very cleverly. What this has to do with the minority government, I'll explain to you right away. And now they want to ban or severely restrict VPNs. But the fact is, nowadays you can only get a VPN subscription, and I've advertised for that. If you have a credit card, then I have to ask which teenager nowadays has a credit card. So, and now there's the topic of a minority government. A minority government would work if you completely open up the parliamentary spectrum again and say, we're talking from the far right to the far left. I never said that the left doesn't have wonderful ideas for this country that could be implemented. I say that multiple times in my videos. I'm also not saying that the AfD only has great ideas. Some of them are too far-fetched even for me. And that's also clear from the context of Björn Höcke. He's not interested in pushing forward any government that would further destabilize this country. Björn Höcke envisions pushing forward a government that would definitely change something here. So basically, he's knocking out the political pillars of the government. Yes, that's actually a pretty good way to put it. And that's exactly why a minority government is the way to completely reinvent this country right now. I hope that doesn't sound like weird wording. But the left doesn't want that at all. They want to keep clinging to their power, just like in the Weimar Republic. And that's exactly why the left doesn't want a minority government. The center and the right really want a minority government now, so they can open up again. Unfortunately, none of this works at all with Friedrich Merz.
A really big problem is that doubts about the ability to act are caused by, of course, the firewall. The Constitution didn't take the firewall into account, so right now we're seeing how well the Constitution and constitutional law actually work.
I apologize in advance. This is going to be an absolutely ultra long video. I can't help it, but I still want to explain to you that in politics, it's not just black and white. When I say that the man should actually resign, that we actually need new elections, actually the budget wouldn't be able to handle that. Then, of course, I refer to the values of our basic law and at the same time to the parliamentary rules of the past 100 years. And this is exactly where there is only one thing regarding these parliamentary rules, and that is Article 68 of the Basic Law. You can take a look at it if you like. This means that the federal president is authorized not to call for new elections. If he says that it's a parliamentary tactical maneuver that he's initiating to deceive the majority, then he can prevent new elections. I didn't even know that was possible, so I read up on it a lot. And that's a point the CDU now has to keep in mind. And if there were to be early elections in the fall, just like the CDU members are saying, then the vote of confidence would have to happen by the very latest. And we're really talking here, if we push everything to the limit, it would have to be called by early July at the latest, which means before the summer break. Otherwise, there won't be any early elections in the fall because first we have the politicians' summer vacation when most of them aren't working, and then the whole thing would be delayed until after the elections. That's something I would rather think about. But this year, it's out of the question for there to be any more budgetary tricks because the IFO Institute has already addressed this several times. And in January, this federal president will be removed from office. Now you can think about what will happen here in Germany when the new federal president is elected. And here I assume that the AfD would vote in favor of almost every CDU candidate. Why will they do that? It's quite simple. If the left-wing base retains the majority here again, you have to expect that before the end of this government, early elections could be prevented by the federal president. To keep pushing the US versus them narrative.
The Constitution does not recognize simply sidelining a certain political direction and a certain number of voters as a matter of principle.
Do we need to tighten things up there?
I left that comment in for you. Yes, if you want a dictatorship, then it's best to tighten things up. If you want to further stabilize a cartel party system, if you want to, like in China, for example, if you really want to cement power, yes, then you would have to tighten things up there. But our democracy, and I'm not talking about their democracy, doesn't allow for that at all. It allows for this. Power comes from the people. By the way, that's also what's written on the Bundestag, to the German people, and not to the politicians, not to the power establishment here in Germany. I have to say, when I saw that podcast by Björn Höcke, it made me think differently about a lot of things. Now you could say, okay, Björn Höcke is Björn Höcke. Yes, I find him likable, to be honest. However, some of the opinions he represents or some of the statements he makes, I don't think are okay. I don't think they're politically okay. But I feel the same way about Friedrich Merz. I even say he's a liar. With Per Bilbas, it's even worse. So here too, the enemy of my enemy is basically my friend, no matter what he does. However, I actually still find him likable, while I don't find other people in the AfD as likable, not even for their statements, but that's democracy. That's just the way it is, what the majority wants. And unfortunately, the only democratic party that's currently there is the AfD. Because they actually do that, and you just don't find that with the CDU or SPD. For example, when there are votes or party conventions or something like that, they stream it on the internet. Anyone out there can watch it and then think about how much common ground they have. You know, the interview with Marcel Queckemeyer, he said something like, yeah, I have 83% overlap. He's in the Bundestag with all AfD positions. I said, okay, I even have 86%, so that's a bit more. But that's exactly what makes up the democratic playing field. We find common ground in the middle. And whenever I basically label everything that's to the right of the CDU as fascist, And at the same time, I also call the CDU fascist when they vote with the AfD. And when you hear storming, then that really has nothing at all to do with democracy anymore. If at the same time you go on public broadcasting or as a YouTuber or even in Welt and say things like, yeah, but why was Hocker allowed to speak there for over 4 hours? Then he does it without putting it into context, without filtering any of it, then all of this has nothing to do with democracy anymore. Democracy, the people decide. Not just some politicians. And that's exactly the power apparatus they want to take away from him. And that's exactly what Frank-Walter Steinmeier is saying. Why he knew, I'm just saying this off the top of my head, how early elections could be prevented by accusing Merz of engaging in political maneuvering. And you can only do that if you cut off the head of the snake from above. The date is at the end of January.
So the Constitution actually says very clearly that Germany must be a democracy. That means anything you would change in the Constitution that would violate the principle of democracy is not possible.
I've already made an ultra-long video about this. These are the eternity clauses and we can't change them. Even if the AfD were an absolutely fascist party with Adolf-like traits and walking around all day with their right hand raised. And even if they still got 2/3 of the votes here in Germany, they wouldn't be able to simply override the eternity clauses, right? That said, I'd still be cautious with a 2/3 majority. But what the establishment parties are doing right now to secure their power, hoping that one day they might be able to make policy for this country, is that in the end, they are watering everything down again. However, the German citizen is not completely out of their mind and stupid. They see it. And I'm getting more and more inquiries as well. By the way, I haven't managed to reply to my emails in the last 14 days. You know who I mean. The German public notices it and simply says, hey, this just isn't right anymore. That's why we see, for example, these campaign events in East Germany where so many people are cheering for AfD politicians. And at the same time, we hear that politicians from other parties are being seriously insulted. And because, of course, the other politicians want to cling to their power, they are now changing the constitution. However, they cannot change the eternity clauses. However, they cannot override the eternity clauses. That doesn't work. They're not allowed to do that either. At the latest, when the Americans and Russians in Germany would say again, no, Merz, you're definitely done, my friend. And there are still enough troops in Germany who could make that happen. And that would absolutely go too far in this video. So you can see this thing is highly complex. Will there be new elections by autumn? Personally, I don't think so. Why not? Because a federal president has already said that he wants to prevent the whole thing. And by doing so, he would be moving into a gray area. But it would be theoretically possible. But if, for example, in January, the AfD were to support a right-wing CDU politician and he gets elected in the third round because he receives the most votes, yes, then the whole thing would be a bit different. He would, of course, immediately go and say, Fritze, call a vote of confidence. I'm calling a snap election. We're trying to bring in stability. At the same time, throw Klingbeil out and then make sure we somehow get pure CDU back. The left is done. That's the only way it would work. And at the same time, all right, by then NGO funding will also run out. Funds too. That has already been brought up beforehand, I would say. So things are already moving forward a bit here. And the first thing Saskia Ludwig said was, I didn't know that all this would take so long. Me personally, neither, because we always thought, yes, we knew the history, we knew the story, and we don't know what kind of new dynamic will develop.
And not just my opinion that the firewall is the opposite of the Constitution, the opposite of democracy. Democracy means everyone talks to everyone. And in these conversations, in this intellectual exchange as well, it can also be a struggle, but an intellectual struggle. And in this intellectual struggle, the best solution then develops. And then a vote is taken on it either in parliament or during elections by the people.
And here, the left-wing democratic spectrum would suffer an absolute disaster, because that's exactly what CDU and AfD have in common. I'm not talking about the fact that the AfD necessarily wants to leave the EU now. I'm not talking about the fact that the AfD would definitely want to buy gas from Putin again. Let's not kid ourselves. The AfD would never agree to that. Never. Not an inch. At least as of today, things would have to get much worse for us. But for example, with nuclear power plants, restarting the nuclear power plants right away. The CDU would agree to that overnight, and really in record time, there would be cheap electricity again. It would take about 12 to 14 months for these nuclear power plants to be back online. At the same time, subsidies for photovoltaics would be cut. On the third attempt, and that's also what the energy policy spokespersons are saying and what the AfD is demanding, storage capacities would first be created here in Germany. We don't have those either. That's an example of a common consensus that the SPD would never agree to, and then the SPD would also break up this coalition at the same time. On the other hand, the SPD is now of course demanding that the payment cards for migrants be abolished again. And the CDU would never go along with that, but they would definitely have a majority for it. Again, also on the AfD side, and they could tighten it even more. That means the Bürgergeld program itself could be reformed again. And here, theoretically, without the SPD, I think 30 billion could be saved if other approaches were taken. These are things that could be implemented immediately with the AfD and also passed in the Bundestag. And this is exactly what the political firewall against the AfD prohibits. In the economy, for example, tax relief, and at the same time we have removed subsidies for photovoltaics and so on. Or, for example, you could say, we will no longer support any NGOs. We won't put any more tax money into NGOs and instead invest it in the economy. The AfD would of course be on board with that right away, but those would be, for example, prestige projects that the SPD would lose. Today they say it costs so many jobs. But on the other hand, jobs are being lost elsewhere in the economy. Here you have a huge range of opportunities to move this country forward again, which the SPD is basically just blocking. And it's not about somehow hacking away at the welfare state. The social wing of the CDU wouldn't agree to that either. But it would be small things like that which would move this country forward again. And that's exactly where the firewall ends.
That's why I see the task as actually ensuring balance within the CDU.
We must never allow a party that still tolerates people like Björn Höcke in its ranks, in prominent positions,
To
be put in positions of political responsibility.
It doesn't have to.
So, and that's exactly the huge problem I just told you about. This evil, not evil, likable Björn Höcke, has 39% in Thuringia as of April 11th, 2026, while the CDU has only 24%. The fact is, almost 60% are against Björn Höcke, and so he didn't get the absolute majority. However, 40% of the voters, or rather 39% of the voters, would also vote for him because he is actually breaking the system. And here with this video, it ended up being super long. I just wanted to explain to you that even when I sometimes write things like early elections now or vote of confidence in the titles, it's actually a bit more complex. And that's why I made this super long video, to explain to you that there are a lot of different factors involved. And even if, say, early elections were held, the citizens can only decide what they want, and what they actually get is a different story. Once again, the case of Björn Höcke. When I hear him, I find him likable. I think some things he says are not acceptable, but I also find that to be the case with others as well. However, yes, if 40% of a constituency would vote for him, because he went from house to house, and that's really in his constituency, he knows almost every mailbox, quote, Björn Höcke, then that does something to people, especially since he also listens to people, even though he is now under police protection and can hardly move around freely anymore. Only if the majority of Germans believe that we want Björn Höcke as Chancellor, then the other political spectrum has to accept that as well. To accept it and not constantly bypass the Constitution with constitutional tricks. You really have to put it that way. At the same time, the Office for the Protection of the Constitution is unique in the world. It doesn't exist anywhere else. That an Office for the Protection of the Constitution monitors or observes an opposition party, yes. In my opinion, something like that should definitely be abolished. You don't find it anywhere else either. These are absolute Gestapo or Stasi methods that we still have installed in our system to, well, prevent political decline. The only question that remains is how many people are actually up there, corrupted by power so that they no longer want to support the normal political cycle, but instead push their own agenda, their own deluded agenda. So, and now I hope that in this video I've cleared things up a bit, even though the title was at the beginning. Early elections in the fall, I explained to you that it's ultra complex. I assume, or rather I don't assume that, but the fact is, yes, that this chaos, the way it is now, will not continue. Whether we get something positive afterwards or something negative, this is an opinion channel. I'm just giving my opinion. It's not called Sasha or Schubert's situation report, just Sasha. It's branded with my personal name, and here I'm just giving my opinion, nothing else. And you guys are simply Team Sasha. And I hope I could just give you some insights that even if I think something is good, it doesn't necessarily have to turn out that way. And sometimes when I think something is bad, it actually turns out better than I thought before. You understand what I'm getting at. By the way, just as a side note, after I listened to Björn Höcke for 4 hours, actually a little over 4 hours, from what he had to say, I believe that he would make a good state premier. And he will probably even represent the interests of all people in Thuringia, not those from the West, but only those from Thuringia. He has prepared for this for so long, he has accumulated so much knowledge, and on the other hand, he has listened a lot that I believe he is much closer to the citizens than many others. And these statements that he makes, and that's exactly the point, and that's the point where we should all think about it for once. He addresses these points with the relevant groups. He says things like, for example, who thinks about our victims in World War II when I was in school, and I'm now over 40 years old, that's how it was back then. We still thought about our own victims, which is absolutely frowned upon today.